Hey everyone. Today's story is about a mobster who might just be the most unlikely boss in Cosa Nostra history, Ralph DeLeo. Born in Arkansas, raised in Massachusetts, he rose from being a petty thief to the acting street boss of the Colombo crime family. But there's a twist. This so called boss was once a cooperating witness. So is Ralph DeLeo a mob rat, or is he just another complex figure tangled into a life of crime, survival, and loyalty? Today on Real Mob Stories with James Proctor, we ask mob rat or false label? The more I started researching this guy, Ralph DeLeo, the more I realized that this story was more than what we all had realized. I found it very fascinating. I think you guys will too, once you hear the story. And so I'm really looking forward to sharing this story with you about who I call the unlikely boss. So we'll start the beginning. So Ralph DeLeo was born in 1943, and he was born in Arkansas, of all places. Even though he moved to Somerville, Massachusetts at an early age. His first couple of years was there in Arkansas. And the guy got into trouble starting, at age 15. And we don't know a lot about his early childhood or education except where he was at, where he lived. We just know his parents were Italian Americans, and so his legal troubles, like I said, started at age 15. You saw a lot of the local newspapers when I look back into the 70s. He was described as a petty loan shark. He was a prolific but inept thief, and he had this reputation as a bungling stick-up man. So in 1968, in April, he was 25 years old, and he gets arrested for three separate robberies. I think there was one that was a Boston department store. There was a small bank robbery where he only got like $2,700. And then, of all places, he robbed a supermarket in San Juan, Puerto Rico. And the judges in those cases granted him bail. This was an oversight he definitely exploited. And while he was out on bail, he held up another bank in Cambridge, Massachusetts, scoring $35,000, but he gets arrested again a month later. And then even facing trial in December of 1968 for the earlier crimes, he robbed another bank for the fourth time. And this was Boston's Capital Bank and Trust. And he got another $15,000. He ended up getting arrested the same day on that. And so he had this pattern of just committing crimes and getting caught. So he didn't do a good job of being able to keep from getting caught. So in the mid 60s and early 70s, he was operating connected with the Patriarca family, and he was lifelong friends with Jerry Angelo. And Angelo was the powerful underboss of the Patriarcha's Boston operations. Even though he was loosely a Patriarcha associate, he was more of what I'd call a loner. There's no evidence of him ever getting formally made into the Patriarchas. He was just an outside affiliate, and he would was useful for running criminal errands. What we know about DeLeo's early exploits, he was involved in loan sharking. He did a lot of freelance burglaries, and he was always able to get out of trouble. He didn't really have to face much time for all those for all those cases. But then in 1976, this whole string of armed robberies finally caught up with him. He gets convicted of armed robbery and kidnapping, and he got a 25 to 40-year sentence, and he had to serve that in the Massachusetts State Prison. Even there, some strange things happen. And so on October 11th, 1977, he actually escapes from prison. He complains of having a stomach ailment, and they send him to the infirmary. And DeLeo ends up overpowering the guard during a bathroom trip. He had a fake gun. He forced the guard to remove his shackles and made the guard, march him out of the hospital at gunpoint. And in the parking lot, he had an accomplice with a getaway car. He ends up being a fugitive, and he goes to Columbus, Ohio. And in Columbus, he he contacted a guy named Dr. Donald Plotnick. And this was a former cellmate from an earlier federal stint. This doctor was hiding DeLeo at his farm. And then while there, he ended up meeting the county coroner. His name was Dr. David Ucker. This guy needed help, so he wanted DeLeo to murder another physician named Dr. Walter Bond, and this was more of a love triangle. There was a pharmacist, a lady pharmacist. I guess both Dr. Bond and Ucker were going out with or whatever, and Ucker was jealous over it, and so he wanted, Dr. Bond kidnapped and mutilated, castrated, and he wanted him to bleed out to death, and DeLeo needed the money, and so he accepted the contract, although he balked at the specifics, so, he didn't end up, castrating the guy, but what ended up happening was that DeLeo ambushed Dr. Bond outside his office, shot him twice in the head and chest. Money was always a problem while he was on the run. And in March of 1978, he attempted to rob the City National Bank in Columbus, Ohio. And he was armed with a hand grenade of all things. And he got the money, but the police were right there, and so they gave chase, and DeLeo actually gets wounded, and well, he fled in a stolen car, but gets shot and wounded in the chase. When they arrest him, he had an alias, he had, disguises with him, so he had a fake wig and I'm sorry, a fake beard and a wig. The time on the run was over. And so he was facing a bunch of state charges. You had the escape that happened from Massachusetts. You had all these armed robberies and now murder. And that's when DeLeo decided to cooperate with authorities. He wanted leniency, and he confessed to a February 1978 jewelry heist, and he even still had the gems with him and returned them. And but the thing that got him what he wanted, was that he implicated Dr. Ucker in the Dr. Bond's killing. So he pointed Dr. Ucker as the mastermind behind that. And that was actually really important because at the time, there was another guy, an innocent man. He was like a local drug addict, had been arrested for Bond's murder. But, they realized that DeLeo was telling the truth about being the trigger man because DeLeo was able to lead them to the gun. He had thrown the gun into a local lake. He also was able to answer investigators' questions about an unrelated 1976 gangland slaying in the state of Maine. And this was a banker named James Cassidy. What's interesting with those tips, it didn't really lead to any indictments. So in May of 1979, DeLeo pled guilty to being the trigger man in that Bond murder, and they sentenced him to 15 years to life in an Ohio state prison. And because of the cooperation, the Ohio authorities was accepted or went with DeLeo's unusual request to serve the time in federal prison rather than state prison. This was really complicated because it also had to involve the state or the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and they had to agree to credit his federal time towards the sentence that he had there. So anyway, there was a lot of complications, and what it looked like is that he would get clemency after about 10 years. He did testify against Dr. Ucker in Ucker's 1979 trial, but Ucker ended up getting acquitted. Really, the public didn't know about this until 2009 when Jerry Capisi ran a piece in Gangland News called Colombo's Made Stool Pigeon the Family Street Boss. And so that's when DeLeo's informant pass kind of came to light. In December of 1986, DeLeo, who was serving in his Senate there in Texas, was assigned a new cellmate, and his new cellmate was little Allie Boy Persico. Persico at the time was 32 years old and was the heir apparent of the Colombo family. And he was serving a 12-year sentence for racketeering. Persico nor any of the other mob inmates had heard about DeLeo being an informant. And so this unlikely friendship formed behind bars, and this friendship really benefited DeLeo. So it's 1997, and DeLeo's finally out of prison. And Allie Boy Persico, due to their friendship in prison, allows DeLeo to be an associate on record with the Colombos. And it just takes like 3 years for, him to get made. So the year in mid 2000, DeLeo, who was living in Boston at the time, went to a private residence in Babylon, Long Island for a secret initiation ceremony. And so this made him a made man in the Colombo family. And so what was interesting about DeLeo's, role in the family now as a soldier, he built up a crew in New England, and so this crew was mostly engaged in dope trafficking, loan sharking, and in bookmaking. But DeLeo was very low profile, and in fact, he worked during the day as a maintenance man, and he did all of his, I guess, mob stuff, you know, at night. And he held court, in Somerville, Massachusetts, and this criminal network up in New England was expanding. They would usually do business at a place called Vinny's Superette in Somerville, which was a local Italian deli, or they would just go to Dunkin' Donuts to coordinate their rackets. By this time, DeLeo's influence had radiated across all of greater Boston, even going beyond Massachusetts. And then he had an enterprise that extended to Arkansas, of all places. So he had another guy that he had been in prison with, is a guy named George Wiley Thompson. He was known as Karate George. And this was a Little Rock based gangster and former karate instructor. This guy Thompson was a Vietnam veteran. He had gotten in trouble for cocaine and gun convictions, but he had built a lucrative sports gambling ring in Arkansas. DeLeo used Thompson to supply muscle and resources in the South. And then besides that, they said that by the late 2000s, about the time that DeLeo became boss, that crew had tentacles in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Arkansas, Florida, and New York. So DeLeo was able to build this criminal network, within the Colombo family. And I think what helped him out was that the Colombo family at the time was weakened. They had went through the Colombo War. They went through all this law enforcement scrutiny, and there wasn't many people out there. So what was going for DeLeo was that he was a moneymaker at this time. He had all these rackets going on in multiple states, and he's bringing a lot of money to the Colombo family, but he was also loyal to the Persicos. One of the things with the Persicos, we know how paranoid they are. Uh, they didn't want a repeat of bringing in someone that would try to take over the family. And so they knew they had someone loyal with Ralph DeLeo, and he was a moneymaker. So in 2008, they made the decision to make Ralph a acting boss. I mean, there wasn't really anyone there for Allie Boy. So instead of going with someone that was known in New York, they went with this outsider to hold the throne for the Persicos. And he doesn't know hardly anything about the people in New York. He was what I would call like a neutral caretaker. So you have this Arkansas born, Boston based outsider who wasn't even slightly connected to either faction of the Colombo family, now running the family for the Persicos. And so June 2008, that's when he's made the acting boss, and he would divide his time between Boston and New York, usually traveling to New York once or twice a month. Actually left most day-to-day decisions to the seasoned New York capital regimes. So really, in effect, the family was run by this committee of Persico loyalists on the street. And for the lower level soldiers, they didn't even know who he was. He was almost like he was a ghost. But even though some might say he was a figurehead boss, he wasn't entirely a puppet. He did have real power, as he was overseeing his own New England crew, and he had other ventures outside of that. In late 2008, he teamed up with Gambino soldier Ernie Boy Abamonte. They were extorting an interstate construction firm called Deca Development there on Long Island, and they were able to land a multi-million-dollar construction job in Boston. They made over $1 million off of that racket. We also know that in February 2009, he officiated a Mafia induction ceremony on Long Island for 6 new Colombo members. Uh, these were all Persico loyalists from Brooklyn. People like Sally from Coney Island and Big Anthony Russo were made that day. DeLeo never even met any of these guys that he was making, and Colombo elders had to coach him on the induction rituals proper protocol. But it showed that he did have real power by conducting the ceremony. So the other thing we can say about his term as boss was that he was astonishingly talkative on the phone. I mean, this was a habit that led to his demise. For whatever reason, I don't know if because he was in prison for so many years or he didn't realize the technology of law enforcement, but he would conduct business over the cell phone and telephones, breach mafia protocol by gabbing in detail about mob business with his sister Michelle. He'd talk about the VIP treatment he received as boss. He talked about having to go to big dinners there in Manhattan that lasted till 1 a.m. He'd talk about how he was greeted with hugs and kisses by wise guys and having everyone open doors and cater to him. And by this time, law enforcement was listening in. They had become aware of DeLeo by 2009. And so they were, setting the trap to bring him in and even more Colombos. And when we look at DeLeo's relations with the other mob families, during his period as acting boss, it was limited but noteworthy. To just think of this, his very presence in Boston running a New York family's crew, that was all unprecedented. It was raising eyebrows in New England. This was the Patriarca family's territory, but as we know, the Patriarchas had went through a lot of problems in the early 2000s. I mean, law enforcement tore them up. The wars that they had tore them up. We know that the Philly crime family had a crew there in Boston. We know it was Bobby Luisi was the captain of that crew. And then we have the Colombo family that have planted their flag there in Boston. And during this time, the Patriarca family had retrenched more into Rhode Island and in Providence, Federal Hill and Providence. Even though this was strange to see, the Patriarchas weakened and allowing, both the Philly mob to have a crew there and the Colombo family to have crews in Boston, there wasn't really any problems between the families. We know that DeLeo was wanting to expand drug trafficking for the Colombo family, but that was saying that Allie Boy didn't want done. He knew the risk of drug trafficking, even though DeLeo's crew was doing dope trafficking up in New England. He wanted to expand it down in Florida, and the Colombo leadership said, no, we're not going to do that. We know that DeLeo then gets taken down by the FBI in 2009. And what had happened is that in the fall of 2008, FBI agents were investigating his friend in Little Rock, Arkansas, Karate George Thompson. Yeah, he had a big bookmaking racket in Arkansas. FBI was suspecting a connection to a bigger enterprise because Thompson's phones were yielding clues about a boss back in Boston. And in December 2008, FBI wiretaps caught DeLeo personally giving driver direction over the phone to a drug courier ferrying cocaine from Arkansas to Boston. And this courier was a Vietnamese kid named Tricam Lee, and he had 2.2 kilos of coke that he picked up in Los Angeles through one of Thompson's contacts. He had driven to Little Rock. There he met Thompson, and both of the men were headed to New England with the shipment, but then Lee got lost. And so they called DeLeo, and you hear DeLeo's voice over the wire. He's painstakingly guiding Lee to a Cambridge, Massachusetts hotel. And so this links DeLeo to an interstate drug deal in real time. And then shortly afterwards, on December 12th of 2008, Arkansas State Police pulled over Lay's vehicle on I-40 outside Little Rock. A drug dog was alerted, and troopers discovered the 2.2 kilos of coke hidden inside, and Lee was arrested on the spot. And this guy Lee was scared to death, and he's calling Thompson, begging to be bailed out, and then you have Thompson calling DeLeo to report the bust, and none of them knew that the phones were tapped. And so Thompson admits, he said, that they knew how much was in there, 2.2 kilos. DeLeo asked about the bail, and it was only $50,000. So DeLeo was thinking, well, the charges shouldn't be too severe if the bond was so low, but that was misplaced optimism. And as expected, Lay ended up flipping. He agreed to cooperate with authorities for leniency. More wiretaps showed Thompson discussing shipments of guns to DeLeo. Thompson was scheming with Arkansas contractors to rig city construction bids. And then in January of 2009, DeLeo's openly talking about mafia affairs on the phone. I mean, he talks about traveling to New York for a sanctioned mafia meeting. He talks about rendezvousing with Mikey Ferrara, who was a Brooklyn-based Colombo soldier. So this guy, Mikey, was DeLeo's main point of contact in the city. So whenever he would come to New York, it was Mikey that was making sure that he got where he needed to go. It was caught up on wiretap about the making ceremony of the 6 new members, and so by mid 2009, the FBI had a comprehensive case tying DeLeo to drug trafficking, sports gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and racketeering spanning multiple states. On December 17th, 2009, the hammer came down. The FBI came in and arrested Ralph DeLeo in a suburb of Little Rock, Arkansas. And then the same day, the indictments were unsealed in Massachusetts, charging DeLeo and his associates with racketeering. So after his 2009 arrest, you don't hear much for a while. It gets caught up in the courts for several years, and finally in 2012 he pleaded guilty in a U.S. District Court in Boston to racketeering conspiracy and related counts. So in the end, Judge Douglas Woodlock imposes a sentence of 19 years and 7 months in federal prison, along with 3 years of supervised release and a $50,000 fine. So DeLeo ends up serving his time in federal prison, spending some of his time there in FCI Lexington in Kentucky. He gets released. DeLeo gets released from prison on May 28th, 2024, shortly before his 81st birthday. He was already in a halfway house, and so by spring of 2024, he had completed his sentence. But within months, FBI agents grew suspicious that this so-called ex-mobster was violating the strict terms of his release. And in May of 2025, barely a year after regaining freedom, DeLeo gets arrested again in Somerville for violating his supervised release and plotting new crimes. He was 82 years old. Initially, we didn't know what was going on. We didn't know why he had violated his, supervised release. But then, just a couple of days ago, we get the chilling allegations. DeLeo had been actively planning to murder at least 3 people, all of them federal officials involved in his 2012 conviction. They had evidence that DeLeo had been seeking personal identifying information on these 3 people, including home addresses, names of immediate family members. Apparently, this plot of retribution has been years in the making. A cooperating informant tipped off the FBI that DeLeo was asking around for this sensitive information, and then when the agents moved in, they uncovered alarming evidence. The search warrant of DeLeo's residence there in Somerville turned up hard copy packets of dossiers on the targeted officials, along with a cache of illicit items. Among the seized items was a full-fledged burglary kit. That had a pry bar, mini crowbar, bolt cutters, and lock-picking tools. Agents also found marijuana and vials of anabolic steroids. He had a handwritten note referencing silicone masks. So basically, what that meant was that he was looking to use realistic disguises to mask his identity during any attack. And we see that DeLeo had been in contact with convicted felons, including former co defendants from his old crew, with the Colombos. As we enter into the middle of 2025, this is all we know about the Ralph DeLeo case. But I just thought it was an interesting story of how he came out of nowhere and became a Colombo street boss. Then we have the dynamics of him ratting. So I'd like to ask you a few questions. I'd love to hear your comments. One, do you think that he was a rat? I mean, this happened before he became part of Cosa Nostra when he made the deal with the government. In my opinion, when you do that, it's ratting. Doesn't matter if you're in Cosa Nostra or not. It's still ratting, and I would think that would disqualify him. But I'd love to know your thoughts on it. And then also, what do you think of him running the family from Boston, being able to build up kind of this empire up in Boston, New England, and all the way to Arkansas and even Florida? The guy did have a reach. He did make money, but it was a interesting way that he brought up started out doing bank robberies and all that, and he's really kind of a bumbling burglar. So just a lot of interesting things about him. So I'd love to know your thoughts on Ralph DeLeo, and that's all we have for today. So please hit the like button and consider subscribing to Real Mob Stories with James Proctor. Until next time, take care, stay safe, and God bless you always.